June 21, 1970. A quiet Sunday morning. Philadelphia. In a federal courthouse, the nation's largest railroad files for bankruptcy. Not a speculative venture, not a bank that made bad loans, not a startup that ran out of money. A railroad. A railroad with more than 20,000 miles of track, nearly 100,000 employees. The most important freight network in the northeastern United States. Its name is Penn Central. 2 years earlier, just 2 years, the men who built it called it the greatest merger in railroad history. They said the combined strength of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central would produce something stronger than either company had ever been alone. They were wrong about almost everything. The collapse did not begin with a market crash. It did not begin with a recession or a bad quarter or a single catastrophic decision. It began with two men running the same company who stopped talking to each other. 100,000 jobs, 20,000 miles of track, a century of American industrial history, gone in 2 years. This is how it happened. If you're new here, this channel covers the real history of American railroads, the engineering, the money, the decisions that built and broke the greatest transportation system in the world. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, back to 1970. To understand how Penn Central collapsed, you first have to understand what these two railroads believed they were. The Pennsylvania Railroad did not merely think of itself as a company. It thought of itself as the standard. At its peak in the early 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest railroad in America by revenue and traffic. It employed more than 250,000 people, more than the United States Army during World War I. Its main line ran through the heart of industrial America, from New York City west through Philadelphia, over the Allegheny Mountains at Altoona, through Pittsburgh, and on to Chicago. It moved the coal that heated American homes, the steel that built American cities, the soldiers who fought American wars. The Pennsylvania called itself the standard railroad of the world. That was not marketing language. It was a genuine operational philosophy. The railroad built its own locomotives at its own shops in Altoona, a sprawling industrial complex that spread across miles of the city, employing 15,000 men in what amounted to a railroad city within a city. It designed its own signals, its own bridges, its own freight cars. When other railroads needed to know how something should be done, they looked to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The New York Central was its equal in ambition, but opposite in character. Where the Pennsylvania was institutional and engineering-driven, the Central was commercial. Its main line, the water-level route, ran along the Hudson River and across the flat plains of upstate New York through Cleveland and Detroit to Chicago. The fastest, smoothest corridor in America. And the Central's flagship train, the 20th Century Limited, was the most famous passenger train in the world for most of the mid-20th century. White tablecloths in the dining car, fresh flowers at every table, a red carpet on the platform at Grand Central Terminal when the train was ready to board. Two great institutions, equal in scale, completely different in culture, different computer systems, different operating philosophies, different ways of moving a freight car from Philadelphia to Chicago. And for more than a century, they were rivals. So why, in the late 1950s, did the men running them decide to become one? The answer starts with a word the railroad industry was hearing more and more and liking less and less: competition. Not from each other. They had always competed with each other. The new competition was coming from outside entirely. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 had set in motion the interstate highway system. Trucks were flooding the new roads, taking freight the railroads had counted on for decades. Airlines were taking passengers. Pipelines were taking liquid bulk commodities. For the first time in their histories, the great northeastern railroads were watching traffic leave and not come back. Revenue was falling, costs were rising, and the men who ran these companies believed they had identified the solution. Scale. Bigger meant more efficient. Bigger meant lower costs. Bigger meant survival. That was the theory. The merger had a champion and a reluctant partner. That tension never went away. And it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Stuart Saunders was the chairman of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was not a railroader by instinct. He was a lawyer and a financier, a man who thought in terms of corporate strategy rather than operating schedules. Saunders believed the future of the Pennsylvania Railroad lay in diversification. Real estate, financial assets, something larger than a railroad. The merger was the first step. Alfred Perlman was the president of the New York Central. He was everything Saunders was not. Perlman was an operator, a railroader in the old tradition, a man who had rebuilt the Central's freight system in the 1950s, modernizing its yards, installing centralized traffic control, cutting costs, and who understood what it took to move trains at the level of equipment, schedules, and the thousand small decisions that determined whether a freight car arrived on Tuesday or sat in a yard until Thursday. He was skeptical of the merger from the beginning. He doubted whether the Pennsylvania's culture and the Central's culture could ever function together. But the pressure was real. The economics were real. And Perlman believed that if the merger had to happen, and he increasingly concluded that it did, he was the man who could make the operations work. That was the unspoken bargain. Saunders would manage the strategy. Perlman would manage the railroad. It never worked the way either of them intended. The merger proposal was first floated in 1957. What followed was 11 years of regulatory proceedings before the Interstate Commerce Commission finally approved the combination. 11 years during which the competitive landscape shifted decisively. 11 years during which the interstate highway system spread across the country, and the economic conditions that had originally justified the merger were fundamentally altered. There was one condition attached to the approval. The Penn Central was required to absorb the New Haven Railroad, a bankrupt commuter carrier serving New England, as part of the deal. The New Haven was hemorrhaging money. Rather than starting its existence as the lean, efficient supercarrier its architects had promised, the Penn Central opened for business, burdened with a failing railroad it had not asked for and could not afford. And Saunders had made another concession to get the merger done. To secure union approval, he guaranteed lifetime job security for all existing employees. In one signature, he eliminated the primary source of labor cost savings that had been the merger's central economic justification. What no one said out loud, not in the press releases, not in the ICC testimony, was what that meant for the numbers. And that silence was the beginning of everything that followed. The merger closed at 12:01 in the morning on February 1st, 1968. The announcement was celebratory. The Penn Central Transportation Company was now the largest railroad in the United States. The press called it historic. The executives called it transformational. Within weeks, the problems were visible to anyone who looked. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central had spent a century developing incompatible systems, not just different corporate cultures, incompatible technical systems at every level of the operation. Their freight car classification procedures were different, their locomotive assignment practices were different, their maintenance schedules were different, and, most critically, their computer systems were completely incompatible. The Pennsylvania had built an IBM-based batch processing system over years of internal engineering. The Central had invested in a more modern, real-time data environment. When the merger closed, no one had built a functional bridge between them. Freight cars crossing the former boundary became, in the language of the men who worked the yards, ghost cars. Without a working connection between the two systems, yard crews could not verify where a car was supposed to go. Cars that should have moved from Buffalo to Philadelphia in 2 days sat in classification yards for a week, looping between terminals because the system could not confirm their destination. Locomotives were dispatched to the wrong facilities. Maintenance records vanished. The Penn Central, on its very first day, was losing track of its own equipment. Car cycle time had averaged 12 days before the merger. Within a year, it had climbed to nearly 16. The difference sounds modest. Across a fleet of 100,000 freight cars, it was catastrophic. PRR employees had spent their careers being told they worked for the best railroad in the world. So had NYC employees. Now they were the same railroad. But whose procedures would govern? Whose people would be promoted? Those questions were being asked simultaneously in thousands of offices and yards across the northeastern United States, and no one at the top of the organization was answering them, because at the top of the organization, something had already gone wrong. Saunders and Perlman were not getting along. By the summer of 1968, 6 months in, the two men had effectively stopped communicating. The railroad they were running had no idea that was happening. To understand what was being lost, you have to stop for a moment and remember what these two railroads had actually been. Not at the moment of their failure, at the moment of their greatness. The Pennsylvania Railroad's electrification program, some 250 miles of main line from New York to Washington and Philadelphia to Harrisburg, represented one of the largest private infrastructure investments in American history. The system ran on 11,000-volt alternating current powered by the railroad's own substations, and the locomotive that ran on it, the GG1, which entered revenue service in 1935, was a machine in a different category entirely. Streamlined, powerful, utterly unmistakable. When a GG1 moved through Penn Station in New York, it moved with authority. The Broadway Limited left that station every evening, arrived in Chicago the following morning, sleeping cars, a dining car with a professional kitchen, a lounge, an observation car. The men who designed those trains were not designing transportation, they were designing an experience. The New York Central's 20th Century Limited ran the same corridor on a parallel route. For decades, these two trains competed for the same passengers, and both of them were magnificent. That era was already ending before the merger. The airlines had been taking passengers since the late 1950s. The interstate highway system was taking freight, and then, in 1967, the United States Post Office canceled its mail-by-rail contracts. At a stroke, it removed the base revenue that had quietly subsidized passenger service on nearly every major named train in the Northeast. The Broadway Limited and the 20th Century Limited had both been cross-subsidized by mail revenue for decades. That subsidy was now gone. The Penn Central accelerated the ending that was already coming. The Broadway Limited lost its dining car, then its sleeping cars, then its frequency. What remained was handed to Amtrak in 1971. What Amtrak inherited was a shadow. And still, through all of this, the Penn Central's public financial statements were telling a different story. A better story. A story that was not true. There is a particular quality to financial failure in large institutions. It rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates in small decisions, in overlooked warnings, in numbers that people in a position to act choose, somehow, not to look at directly. The Penn Central's deterioration followed this pattern with unusual fidelity. From its first day, the railroad was losing money on passenger service. That was expected. Both predecessor railroads had operated unprofitable passenger services for years. The Penn Central's internal analysis in 1968 showed passenger operations losing more than $85 million annually. That number did not improve, it worsened. The freight operation was supposed to generate enough surplus to cover the passenger losses and still produce a profit. It did not. The computer integration problems that began on day one were still unresolved months later. Car cycle times were climbing. Equipment utilization was falling. Every projection in the business case was running the wrong direction. But what the Penn Central's public financial statements showed was something quite different. The accounting practices used were, by the standards of the era, technically permissible, but they obscured the severity of the losses in ways that mattered enormously. Profits from real estate subsidiaries, including holdings in companies like the Great Southwest Corporation and Arvida, were consolidated with railroad operating results. Income from asset sales was classified as operating revenue. The Penn Central reported net income of $90 million in 1968. The actual operating loss of the railroad itself that year was closer to $5 million. Most striking of all, through 1968 and into 1969, the Penn Central continued paying dividends to its shareholders, nearly $100 million in dividends over those 2 years, while simultaneously borrowing money at interest rates as high as 10% just to meet payroll. The dividends were an attempt to maintain the stock price so the company could keep using its shares as collateral for the loans that kept the trains running. It was a financial structure that could only end one way. But the real problem wasn't just bad accounting. The man managing this structure was David Bevan, the Penn Central's chief financial officer. Bevan understood exactly what the numbers showed. He also understood that showing them clearly would have consequences. It emerged after the bankruptcy that he had been using his position to benefit himself personally. Through a holding company called Penfil, controlled by Bevan and a small group of insiders, he had channeled Penn Central funds into outside ventures, including a private airline called Executive Jet Aviation. While the tracks were deteriorating and the yards were in chaos, Penn Central money was quietly finding its way into Bevan's private aviation venture. The full scope of what he had been doing only became visible after the collapse. The board of directors took the financial statements at face value. When Perlman raised alarms about the physical condition of the infrastructure, his warnings were not heard in the way they needed to be. Meanwhile, the physical railroad was getting worse by the month. The Penn Central inherited a massive deferred maintenance backlog from both predecessor railroads. Both had been cutting maintenance spending for more than a decade. When they merged, the accumulated backlog of track repairs, bridge inspections, signal upgrades, and locomotive overhauls was enormous, and it was growing. On the Northeast Corridor, the electrified main line from Washington through Philadelphia and New York to Boston, the situation was severe. The catenary infrastructure was aging. In the late 1960s, pantograph failures were tearing down miles of overhead wire with increasing frequency, paralyzing service on the busiest passenger rail artery in the country for hours at a time. Track conditions had deteriorated to the point where trains could no longer safely operate at the speeds the line was designed for. By the early 1970s, passenger trains on parts of the corridor were running at 40 miles per hour on track engineered for 100. Passengers noticed, not the technical numbers, but they noticed the delays, the cancellations, the dirty cars, the food service reduced from a dining car to something that barely qualified as a cafeteria. What Penn Central's passengers experienced, with increasing frequency, was a system that had stopped caring. Freight shippers were reaching the same conclusion by a different route. In 1969, the chaos in the Penn Central's yards reached a level that became impossible to ignore. Thousands of tons of Maine potato harvest were left to rot in freight cars because the railroad could not move them through congested yards quickly enough. Farmers who had shipped by rail for generations permanently shifted to trucking. They did not come back. Cars that should have moved from Ohio to New Jersey in 2 days were sitting in yards for 10. A truck could make the same trip in 12 hours. For any business that needed predictability, the choice was becoming obvious. Every customer who left took revenue the Penn Central could not replace. The track got worse. The losses grew. More customers left. The spiral was self-reinforcing, and by 1969, it was clearly visible to anyone inside the company who was looking honestly at the numbers. Most of the people at the top were not. The Penn Central's leadership structure had, by this point, effectively ceased to function as a decision-making body. Saunders and Perlman were not speaking. Decisions that required both of them went unmade. Memos went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. The two men who were supposed to be steering the largest railroad in the United States were operating in parallel universes while the institution beneath them deteriorated. Senior managers caught between the PRR faction and the NYC faction found themselves with no neutral authority to appeal to. The board of directors, which should have intervened months earlier, did not act decisively until it was far too late. Saunders resigned as chairman in January of 1970. Perlman left at the same time. By then, the financial situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The Penn Central's internal projections in the spring of 1970 showed a company approximately 90 days from running out of cash, burning through $1 million every single day just to keep the signals lit and the crews paid. The credit lines were exhausted. The banks that had lent money to the railroad were no longer willing to extend more without government guarantees. The management team that might have negotiated those guarantees had just resigned. The collapse threatened consequences far beyond the railroad itself. The Penn Central had issued hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial paper, the short-term loans American businesses used to meet payroll. When it became clear the Penn Central could not repay, the Federal Reserve was forced to intervene in the broader credit market to prevent one railroad's failure from triggering a cascading crisis across American business. For a few weeks in the spring of 1970, this was not just a transportation problem, it was a potential financial system problem. The railroad went to Washington asking for a federal bailout loan. The Nixon administration considered it. The Department of Defense was consulted. The Penn Central operated tracks essential to the movement of military equipment and coal for the East Coast's power plants. For a period of weeks, there was a real possibility that the federal government would provide emergency financing. It did not happen. The loan was rejected. On June 19, 1970, the Penn Central's board voted to seek bankruptcy protection. 2 days later, the petition was filed. The largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time was complete. The railroad could not be liquidated. Shutting down 20,000 miles of track through the most economically productive region of the United States, cutting off commuter rail service to hundreds of thousands of passengers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, was too large a consequence to contemplate. The bankruptcy court kept the railroad running while the question of what to do with it was worked out over years of litigation and political negotiation. What the court could not do was fund the maintenance that years of deferred investment had left unresolved. The physical deterioration accelerated even after the bankruptcy. Derailments, which had already doubled from roughly 1,200 annually before the merger to more than 2,400 by 1969, continued to climb. Speed restrictions multiplied. The Northeast Corridor continued to degrade. Congress responded in stages. In 1971, it created Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, to take intercity passenger service off the hands of the private railroads. Penn Central's trains became Amtrak trains. In 1976, Conrail, the Consolidated Rail Corporation, absorbed the Penn Central and 6 other bankrupt Northeastern railroads into a single federally managed entity. The federal government invested approximately $7 billion in Conrail between 1976 and 1987. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980 deregulated freight rates for the first time in a century, giving railroads the pricing flexibility they needed to compete. Conrail's finances improved steadily. In 1987, the federal government sold it as a profitable private railroad. In 1999, Conrail was split between CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern. The Pennsylvania Railroad's historic main line, from Philadelphia over the Alleghenies through Altoona to Pittsburgh and Chicago, became part of Norfolk Southern's network. The tracks are still there. The horseshoe curve is still there. The Penn Central bankruptcy is studied in business schools as a case in corporate governance failure, management dysfunction, accounting manipulation, the consequences of prioritizing financial engineering over operational reality. All of that analysis is correct, but it is not the most important thing the Penn Central's collapse represents. The most important thing is what was lost and cannot be recovered. The Pennsylvania Railroad had spent a century building something that cannot simply be reconstructed. An integrated operational culture in which tens of thousands of people shared a common set of standards, a common set of expectations, and a common institutional identity. That identity had a name. It had a symbol, the Keystone. It had a physical home in Altoona, where the sprawling Juniata and South Altoona shops spread across miles of the city and represented one of the greatest concentrations of mechanical engineering knowledge ever assembled in one place. Men there could build a locomotive from raw steel. They could design a bridge. They could solve problems that had no precedent. When that institution failed, the culture did not transfer intact to whatever came next. It dispersed. The people who carried it retired or moved to other industries or found themselves working for organizations with different histories and different loyalties. The accumulated knowledge, what it took to run a railroad through the Allegheny Mountains in January, how to route freight through the classification yards at Conway, faded as the people who held it left. Penn Station in New York was demolished in 1963, 7 years before the bankruptcy. Its demolition was a business decision. The air rights above the station were more valuable in short-term financial terms than the station itself. The Pennsylvania Railroad needed the money. It sold the sky above one of the most extraordinary buildings in America to pay its debts. The public reaction was the catalyst for landmark preservation legislation, first in New York City, then nationally. That change came too late for Penn Station itself. And here's the argument that the Saunders versus Perlman narrative can obscure. Other railroads operating under the same regulatory conditions, the Southern Railway, the Norfolk and Western, remained profitable through the 1960s and 1970s. The regulatory framework was genuinely hostile, but it was not uniquely lethal. Management decisions amplified what were genuine structural pressures into a catastrophe. The Penn Central collapse ultimately revealed a failure of institutional purpose. The Pennsylvania Railroad had been built by men who understood railroading as a vocation, who believed that moving goods and people efficiently, safely, and reliably was work worth doing for its own sake. The men who ran the Penn Central in its final years believed something different. They believed the railroad was a financial asset to be managed and redeployed. The difference between those two beliefs produced the difference between an institution that lasted a century and one that lasted 2 years. The Penn Central's failure produced consequences that are still visible more than 50 years later. Amtrak exists because of Penn Central. The National Railroad Passenger Corporation was created in 1971 specifically because Congress recognized that intercity passenger rail could not survive as a private enterprise under the conditions that then existed. Whatever the debates about Amtrak's subsequent history, involving chronic underfunding, inconsistent political support, and performance that has varied widely across its network, its existence represents a permanent acknowledgement. Passenger rail is a public good. It requires public investment. Penn Central made that argument irrefutable. The Staggers Act of 1980 exists because of Penn Central. The Northeastern Railroad crisis of the 1970s created the political conditions necessary to deregulate an industry that had been strangled by rate controls for nearly a century. The American freight railroad system today, which by every metric moves more tonnage more efficiently at lower real cost than the freight railroad system of any other developed country, is in significant part the product of reforms that Penn Central's bankruptcy made politically possible. And the infrastructure deficit of the Northeast Corridor today exists in large part because of Penn Central. The NEC is the busiest passenger rail corridor in the United States. More than 50 million passengers travel it annually. The infrastructure supporting it, the tunnels under the Hudson River connecting New Jersey to Manhattan, the Portal Bridge over the Passaic River, the B&P tunnels in Baltimore, is aging, overloaded, and chronically underfunded. The Gateway Program, the project that would add new tunnels under the Hudson River and expand the corridor's capacity, has been in various stages of planning and partial funding for more than a decade. Its estimated cost exceeds $30 billion. Progress has been inconsistent. The roots of that situation run directly back to the Penn Central era. The decisions made in the 1960s and early 1970s to defer infrastructure investment, to treat the physical railroad as a source of value to be extracted rather than maintained, created a deficit that subsequent decades of investment have not fully closed. The condition of the Portal Bridge, built in 1910, long overdue for replacement, the aging signal systems, the tunnels that carry the weight of 50 million annual journeys on infrastructure designed for a different era. All of it reflects decisions that trace their origins to Penn Central. Every time a passenger train is delayed crossing the Hackensack River on a bridge that has been scheduled for replacement for 40 years, Penn Central is there, not as a name, but as a consequence. Stuart Saunders left the Penn Central in January of 1970, 5 months before the bankruptcy. He spent the rest of his career defending his decisions, arguing that the merger was sound, that the problems that followed were products of circumstances beyond anyone's reasonable control. There is something to that argument. The regulatory framework governing the railroad industry in 1970 was genuinely hostile to profitability. The competitive pressure from highways and airlines was real and structural. But the argument fails to account for the choices that made difficult circumstances into catastrophic ones. The lifetime job security guarantee that eliminated the merger's labor cost savings before the merger had even begun. The financial practices that obscured the depth of the losses from the people who most needed to understand them. The capital diverted from maintenance into real estate and aviation ventures. The governance failure that allowed two top executives to stop communicating for the better part of 2 years while 100,000 people depended on them. Alfred Perlman also left in January of 1970. He had been warning about the operational deterioration for 2 years. His warnings had not been heeded. His departure did not change what was coming. David Bevan was eventually charged with fraud. The legal proceedings that followed the bankruptcy revealed the scope of the Penfill arrangement and the executive jet aviation investment, the self-dealing through which Bevan and a group of Penn Central insiders had enriched themselves using the railroad's funds. Bevan maintained that his actions were within the rules as he understood them. The courts disagreed. The Penn Central's board of directors emerged from the crisis with their reputations severely damaged. Congressional investigations in the 1970s documented the board's failure to exercise meaningful oversight, its failure to investigate warning signs visible in the financial statements, and its effective abdication of the governance responsibilities that corporate directors are legally required to fulfill. What is striking, looking back from 50 years later, is not the villainy. What is striking is the ordinariness of the failure. Ambitious men who believed they were building something historic, an institution that had convinced itself the numbers it was seeing were the real numbers, a board that found it easier to accept reassurance than to demand clarity. These are not exotic failures. They recur. They recurred before Penn Central, and they have recurred since. What makes Penn Central distinctive is the scale and the completeness of the collapse. In 24 months, the largest railroad in the nation went from groundbreaking ceremony to federal courthouse. On a clear morning in Altoona, Pennsylvania, a Norfolk Southern freight train climbs the grade toward the horseshoe curve. The tracks are the same tracks the Pennsylvania Railroad laid. The curve, completed in 1854 after years of engineering that transformed what every expert said was an impassable mountain barrier, sits at the heart of what was once the most important railroad territory in America. The approach from Altoona rises nearly 93 feet for every mile of track. Into the curve itself, the grade eases to 1.5%, still a relentless pull for a loaded westbound freight, still requiring every horsepower the locomotive can produce. The men who engineered this grade understood something that the men who ran Penn Central did not, that the work they were doing would outlast them, that they were building something permanent. The train running those tracks today does not carry a Pennsylvania Railroad Herald. The company that owns them has a different name, a different history. The men who built what the train moves on are gone. The institution they served is gone. The institution failed, but the infrastructure endured. The Pennsylvania Railroad spent a century believing the system it had built was permanent, that the combination of physical infrastructure, operational culture, and institutional identity it represented was too important to fail. It was wrong about the institution. It was right about the tracks. The horseshoe curve endures. The tunnels through the Alleghenies endure. The Northeast Corridor endures, older now, more strained, in need of the investment it has been too long denied, but still running, still the most important passenger rail artery in North America, still moving millions of people each year through the territory the Pennsylvania Railroad built its empire to serve. They thought the institution would last forever. It didn't. But the tracks did. If this video was worth your time, subscribe to American Iron Archives. Hit the bell. Every video on this channel is built from archival footage you won't find anywhere else. The next one is already in production.